So seeking a good Anthropocene. Obviously, the word good is implicitly a word that's more in the realm of philosophies and the social sciences. It's about values. And we are, for better or worse, consciously or unconsciously, we've now become a geophysical, geological, geochemical, genetic force on the planet that will have a long-lasting imprint, both in biology and in strata. Whether you look at the radioisotopes or just the carbon that's going to be laid down. And this, to me, back in 1992, presented a sense of responsibility. And this gets back to the ethics. That, awareness theoretically breeds responsibility. You can't sort of not consider the implications of something once you know about it, at least not ethically. 2 billion years ago, cyanobacteria were an utter catastrophe for the environment. They started adding oxygen to the atmosphere. And it was a mass extinction. It totally screwed up the global ecosystem, but they weren't sitting there going, wow, look what we just did. And we are sitting here slowly going, wow, look what we just did. So it's a really unique kind of juncture. And how this plays out, nobody really knows yet. And that's kind of, you could look at that and go, oh my God, or you can look at that and go, wow, what an amazing time to be alive. And I kind of choose the latter overall, you'll see. So here's my place in the Anthropocene. That's my birthday. If you go to populationaction.org, you can punch in your birth date and find out how many people were on the planet when you were born. And for those of us who were born mid-century last year, we kind of were right at the beginning of this pulse of us, this cresting, astonishing wave of both numerical addition of people and potency through appetites for stuff. Look at this assembly of curves, all these the great acceleration they call it. If you just Google for that, you find this. It's wonderful. Wonderful or horrible. But it's like, you can look at any curve for nitrogen, phosphorus, CO2, food production. It's all zoom. And most curves in nature don't go zoom perpetually. They go zoom and then something happens. There's a recalibration, like a sand dune on a beach, builds and builds and then kind of collapses and builds and builds. So we haven't gotten to that thing yet, that juncture, and we are heading there soon. And can we adjust? Can we kind of manage it? Or do we just have to ride it out? These are big questions, and we haven't answered remotely yet. Now, what does this Anthropocene really look like? It looks kind of like this from one perspective. And you look at this and you think, okay, 9 billion people. Can 9 billion people do that? So if we have a purely economic growth kind of model and aren't thinking about levels of consumption, the idea that you could see 9 billion people doing that doesn't feel very tenable to me. If you were like out in a spacecraft, an alien looking at us, with a sort of weird time frame, you'd see, wow, look at this. They're just like bacteria on agar. They're just kind of, you plunk them down and they just are growing and growing. And then what scientists have done in the last few decades really is just said, hey, there's an edge to the Petri dish. And that's there's all these different, there are all these different, what do you call them, memes for that. There's the global footprint, there's the boundaries. That's the hot one now, planetary boundaries. But there's an edge, there's a limit to how much you can do. And here's the deal though, the scientists, and this is where the social sciences start coming in handy, they're kind of like Moses coming down from the mountain, with these tablets. This was Martin Parry in 2007 rolling out the third IPCC report. And you can see, ecosystems, food, stress, coast health, where climate change is going to have this set of impacts that are getting worse and worse. And they had the curve with the burning embers diagram so that, guess what? Rising temperatures means rising impacts. Wow, that took hundreds of scientists to kind of figure that one out. But here's the problem. Society is really mostly engaged on other issues, and here comes this chiding kind of parental figure. And you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of this.
Well, you know what kind of drunken brawls those kind of parties turn into. It's not a place for kids.
A minute ago, you said you didn't care if he drinks.
He said a little drink.
You're tearing me apart!
So James Dean is, the world going, oh, give me a break, We're just trying to make a living. We're just trying to, get less poor. We're just trying to get richer. And you're telling us there are limits and, go away. And I started looking into, I've been writing about climate change for decades, and it was only in the mid-2000s that I started digging in on the social science about how people react to or ignore risks of various kinds. And so then I saw these reactions. People have reactions. One side calls the other side denier or climate ostriches. I love that. Lynn Cherry came up with that diagram, the cartoon. And then in the meantime, they're saying we're all chicken littles and alarmists, and you see they're all reacting differently to this messaging. And when you look at the social science, the psychology particularly tells you this is utterly normal, that there's a range, there's a distribution of people in society. In this room, less so because we're a self-selected group. But in society generally, you end up with people reacting to the same information differently. And this research, as I started digging in, I wrote this piece in 2006 called Yelling Fire on a Hot Planet for the Weekend Review section with that diagram in it. That's when I started realizing, oh my God, more information doesn't solve problems like this. More information reinforces positions. So people read my articles or look at a paper in the journal and have completely different reactions. And that really disturbed me. But it was really important. It was actually scarier than the research on glaciology, the erosion of Greenland ice sheet or what's happening with sea ice. This felt to me much more profound in many ways. And go to culturalcognition.net if you are not cognizant of some of this work. Dan Kahane at Yale leads one of the very interesting efforts along these lines. So what I did was I did a little experiment. I took I looked at the Nobel Prize winners in physics who've been vocal in some way or other about global warming. So they're a self-selected group. They're people who wanted to voice their opinion. I didn't survey, all the Nobel Prize winners in physics. And it found, you can basically, if you want to go into a climate argument with any point of view, you can find a Nobel laureate in physics to support your point of view. Ivar Gaever from Rensselaer, now emeritus, when the American Physical Society came out with this statement about climate change a few years ago saying that warming of the planet is incontrovertible, his hair caught on fire. Because to him, only religious beliefs can lead you to something being incontrovertible. Science is all about digging in and challenging truths. There's no real truth. And Bert Richter, of course, he's an energy whiz, he likes nuclear power as a solution to climate change, mostly. He's written a really good book on energy. Robert Laughlin is kind of in the mushy middle, and Steve Chu, of course, was Obama's energy secretary and is very gung-ho on both R&D, which is something I've been pushing for a long time, and renewables. So you can kind of go out and arm yourself with a Nobel laureate and go into a fight and come out the other end, and you'll all just be reinforced. So when I started working more on that stuff and writing about that, especially when I started blogging, then I realized, and here I am in my mid-50s, and I started feeling like this cameraman. This was at the Copenhagen Climate Talks. My last day as a full-time employee of the New York Times was that day. It was the day that they came to that kind of mushy non-agreement. And we were all in this press room. There were 2,000 reporters in this room. I mean, oh, God, it was horrible. And so I flew back home, and that was when I started my transition to coming to Pace University. I had already been planning it, but that was my last day. And it was a time for reflection for me. I was in my mid-50s, now I'm in my late 50s. And I had this amazing career. I've been, as you heard, to the North Pole. I've been to the Amazon. I wrote a book about Chico Mendes in the late 80s, and been around the world, been in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and I started to say, what do I want to do the rest of my life? Basically, I felt like I was kind of halfway through my professional life. And just doing more journalism, being cognizant of this stuff, I just couldn't see justified. So that's why when I negotiated for a position at Pace, my title is Senior Fellow for Environmental Understanding. I'm not a journalism professor. I'm not even a communications professor, although I mainly teach communication courses. I'm examining this question of what information matters. How does information change people or engage people on environmental issues that are mostly slow drips? On my blog, if you looked at the right-hand side of .earth, there's these categories of things: slow drips, hard knocks. And quite often, slow drips lead to hard knocks, so they're all kind of interrelated. But in yourself, whether it's an untended toilet or in my house right now, we went 2 extra years without pumping the septic tank. I just couldn't believe that I let that slide, so it's like, that's going to eventually fail the septic field. And I let it slide for 2 years. They're coming next week, finally. But so we all know about slow drips, and we know about the hard knocks they can lead to. And of course, it can be, not studying through the course of a year if you're in high school or college. And so that's when I decided I'm not just going to do journalism. I'm going to focus on many more things, and with my remaining years, still do journalism through my blog. And then recently, someone challenged me ahead of a conference in Portland, Oregon, that was organized around the question of the word perfect. I was challenged to come up with something that I felt was perfect. And most of what I write about is highly imperfect, our response to climate problem among them. But then I kind of dug in really deep, reflecting on all that I've learned or experienced, and I concluded this, that you saw in a minute ago, that we really are, when you consider the challenge that we face in this century, we are kind of perfect. It's a highly imperfect way of being perfect, as you'll see. And so I add an asterisk, of course. And it's a big asterisk. But with work, with sustained effort, you'll see what's changed in me. We can have a successful journey in this century. There'll always be mistakes, and there have to be mistakes. We have to embrace mistakes, actually, to get things right. And variegation is our friend. Having diversity of views. Some are not useful. There are some parties out there who are just obstructionists. That's just the way it is. And that will always be the case. But I think when you look overall, we're actually kind of going to do okay with some work. And that's what I want to explain. And I'm going to leave time for questions and stuff so you can go, what was he thinking? But I got to go back in time again. So I'm going to go to 1968, which for me, I was about 12 years old, and the world to me was pretty perfect. Here I am, growing up in Rhode Island. That's me and my brother. Fishing was a real avenue for me to get connected with nature. Other people have other avenues. But I used to we lived in this suburban fringe, and I could walk through a field, through the backyard of our sort of colonial house, through some woods, across a field, down to a river right behind a supermarket. So it was, there's like abandoned shopping carts and stuff. But it was a river where I could sit on the mossy bank all by myself and just throw in a line or just sit and be a 12-year-old. And it was great. But of course, now 68 was not a great time. As you can see, we were dealing with a hugely imperfect world, everything from Vietnam to assassinations. It was tumultuous and actually really, really a horrible time. Nuclear fear was a real phenomenon, and the population bomb was the big bestseller of the year. 2 million copies sold, Paul Ehrlich's book. Didn't play out the way he had foreseen at that time, but some of the core issues are still percolating out there. So one of the, growing up, and especially growing up kind of focused on the environment and nature, one of the memes this is before there were memes. I think that word, who was it? There was someone came up with that word. I mean, it goes back to Greek etymology, but someone used it in the 70s, I think. So in the 60s, it wasn't a word yet, but this was one of them. Woe is me. Oh shit. Oh my, that was, the world was coming unglued, and the other one was this one, shame on you. So, woe is me, shame on you. These were these kind of resonating themes that really were a core part of the environmental movement from those early days in the 60s and 70s onward. Woe is me, shame on you. The world's coming unglued and it's someone else's fault. You, or George Bush, or Exxon, or whatever, even though I'm driving a car and filling up with gasoline sold by Exxon. But it felt like that was the mission. It had a mission feel, it had a movement feel, especially because there were so many other movements at the time, anti-war and civil rights. So for me, a 12-year-old, I started having my own shame on you moments. In the woods behind my house, one day I'm waltzing over to get to the Hunts River, and there was a bulldozer in my woods. I mean, there weren't my woods, the property line was here. The bulldozer was there, and so suddenly I realized someone was going to develop that land and cut down some of my trees. And I ran back in the house, and I got a piece of paper and a red pen, and I wrote a death threat. A 12-year-old death threat, like whosoever defiles these woods will die in horrible flames or something like that. This is my first sort of Earth First moment. I know. And I felt good about that. Later, of course, I wasn't cognizant at 12 that just maybe 10 years earlier, there had been a bulldozer that had created the landscape that I was living on happily. That my house wasn't there 15 years earlier, that was a farm most likely, and that what was happening next door, my field, impeding my right to enjoy the nature, I had implicitly acted upon the environment. And so but that came later. That kind of awareness doesn't necessarily come at 12. But there's an upside to this movement aspect of things. As you'll hear, there are people here. Well, the Bullfrog Films people did films about the Earth Day. the Earth days, and here's the New York Times front page. Look at that, it's just magnificent, magnificent, unbelievable to think that we had millions of people in the streets around the country because of woe is me and shame on you. So it has utility. It's not like wrong. It's just going forward, I'll explain why I think it doesn't work as well. And so as a young journalist in the early 80s, when I moved from my biology degree to wanting to write about science and the environment instead of do the science, I started writing about really no-brainers. There's some really stupid things happening in the world. Paraquad, the herbicide, which is similar to Roundup, is incredibly effective, and it's a great herbicide. It's a revolutionary tool for agriculture. It allows you to do no-till farming, where you spray the field. It doesn't persist in the environment like DDT. It latches onto clay molecules and gets deactivated completely. So, in theory, it's this great tool. The problem is it's a brown liquid, and people were taking it out of the bottle with the skull and crossbones and pouring it into old whiskey bottles in places like Trinidad and India, and people were dying. As it turned out, when I did my reporting, about 1,000 or 2,000 at least around the world each year were dying either of suicide or of accidental ingestion of this stuff. And I mean, it was such low-hanging fruit. Like, this was a brochure from ICI, the British company that made Paraquad at the time. And look at this guy. This is in their own literature. A man with bare feet in a field spraying his own feet with a chemical that, if it gets into your body in sufficient quantities, turns your lungs, as one pathologist told me, they crunch like Rice Krispies because it selectively poisons the lung tissue. So this was, it was great. It was good journalism. I won a big award for this, my first big magazine story. So, I'm on track. Go, go, go. Shame on you. Woe is me. And I started in the mid-'80s is when I started writing about climate, the human relationship to climate. My first article was not about global warming. It was about nuclear winter, because we were still in the Cold War, and some of the same climate models that are now used to show what greenhouse gases will do were used to show that if you had a lot of sooty aerosols in the atmosphere after a nuclear exchange, not only was the war bad enough, but you were going to chill the climate, ruin agriculture, potentially disrupt ecosystems in a terrible way. So that was 1985. By 1988, I started on my trajectory writing about global warming. And look at this. Woe is me, shame on you, woe is me, shame. You can see. How many different approaches to magazine covers have you seen? Trying to sell the global warming problem. There's the frying egg, there's the melting, whatever this is, and on and on. And then, of course, as you heard, in the mid-2000s, it continued. Once I got to the New York Times in 1995, around 2000, I moved to covering global warming for the Times, from doing regional stuff like PCBs in the Hudson and nuclear Indian Point. And I did some investigative work on what was happening with Bush administration, politicization, what a horrible word, of things like NASA. And it was really egregious, some of the things that happened. So again, getting back, shame on you actually is really important. There's tons of stuff that still happens that needs to be exposed. It's easier now to expose it than ever. There's more transparency being imposable in the world than there has been in the past. So I think we're heading in a good direction that way. But still, in the end, circling back, getting to this point in my career, I won a lot of awards. I've been, written about every facet of the climate problem, from the North Pole to the Amazon, to the White House, to legislation, to energy technology, to disinvestment in basic research and development, to carbon trading, to the treaty process. And I started to realize, as I've said a minute ago, but I'm going to try to emphasize it, that and then disinformation, the whole disinformation campaign, the uncertainty, doubt sprinklers, that, again, even that didn't matter to a certain extent. And I gave a talk about this a couple of years ago, and a young student at Columbia, Kathy Zhang, heard me describe the dilemma, and she drew this cartoon. And so the dilemma is that this information battle over global warming isn't like, well, if they stop shouting hoax or whatever, then everyone will magically galvanize around decarbonization of our economy and the global economy. When you look at the trajectories and our dependence on fossil fuels, you realize that we are kind of this big boulder, this big fossil boulder society is, and we really like fossil fuels. All of our lives have been built around them. Suburbia exists because of them. Undoing suburbia is a really hard thing. In uninventing suburbia, I wrote a piece, if you Google for uninventing suburbia, you'll see some stuff about that. So if you cleaned up the information wars, you'd still have this rock sitting there And inertia is the great unspoken enemy of action on climate change. We don't hear about it a lot. We hear about the bad guys and the good guys. But what the reality is, the bad guys are trying to move a boulder that's really happy where it is. The good guys. And the guys who want stasis are there with a feather duster just kind of going, So the idea that Coke money is like the thing that makes the difference, to me, it doesn't hold up. But that's just me. You know, I'm not saying that I'm right. I'm just saying that's my hypothesis. It may not be testable. And here's another reason why don't expect that perfect information on climate change will solve the climate problem. Because just take a look at this. After Fukushima, after that devastating accident caused by the tsunami, an earthquake at this Japanese power plant, George Monbiot, who was a British environmentalist and writer, who is essentially the Bill McKibben of England, and Bill McKibben wrote in the same day in The Guardian pieces with diametric columns about this. Monbiot said the fact that this didn't produce a runaway reaction and meltdown, and the importance of having a rapid deployment of something that's non-carbon for an energy source, he said Fukushima showed us that we need to move forward with nuclear power. And Bill McKibben, of course, wrote that, no, this proves nuclear power is brittle, we have to move away from nuclear power. So here are two people who spent their whole careers trying to act on global warming, and in the face of the same information, they have completely different reactions too. So it isn't even just about the global warming problem, it's about the what you do about it problem has the same complexity. And you could look at that and say, oh my God, we're screwed. Or you could look at that and say, maybe what we need to do is start to figure out in the environmental movement or in environmental thinking, how can you normalize and integrate having a variegated approach to action? And I'll give you an example, and I just thought of this tonight as I was talking with someone earlier today. I had my worst college interview, by far, like orders of magnitude, was at Williams College. My brother was at Williams, he's older than me. And I met with this guy, Mr. Smith. He's like think of the Mr. Smith from The Matrix, okay? The Iceman. I'll never forget, I can't remember his first name. And so I'm there spieling about, I was the president of the student council, and I did the school newspaper, and blah, 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 blah. I spent like 5 minutes telling him what a well-rounded individual I am. And he sits back silently, there's about a 20-second delay, and then he says, we don't want a class of well-rounded individuals. We want a well-rounded class of individuals. Do you see the difference? I articulated I was like everything, and he said, no, we don't want you to be everything. We want you to be the one great special thing that you are. So what I'm trying to get at is that I think he's right in a way, that we need a society of individuals who have, there's the geek who's going to transform photosynthesis, do an artificial photosynthesis breakthrough. There's Susan Solomon, who was a scientist who did not prefer to be an activist. There's Jim Hansen, who's a scientist who preferred to be an activist and get arrested. There's these young kids I met in 2005 at the climate talks, chanting in the hallways. And then there are kids who are pursuing other avenues. And so I think somehow we have to be okay with that. And for the most part, the climate campaign hasn't been okay with that. You can't be for nuclear power. You can't be for responsible use of natural gas. You can't be for anything that isn't about a price on carbon. And I think, I don't know how, but I think variegation is our friend in the end. And so this gets to the biggest learning moment for me has come in the last year or two, and it's around what our goals are for the Anthropocene. And with climate being one of the big challenges, obviously, along with conserving biodiversity. So our goals have always, at least for years, for most of the time I've been working on this problem, have been numbers. 80% by 2050, 350, 2 degrees. But when you really dig in on these numbers and you realize we don't know how to get there, we know how to get there on paper. Jacobson at Stanford and others have done really compelling papers that show how New York State could be free of carbon by 2050, but it's on paper. And the question is, how would you do that in the real world that's like the big boulder, the stasis boulder? How do you actually make that happen with our policy norms and our divisions and our need for cheap energy today? Treaties matter and laws matter for sure, but what matters to me is, so what would you want? If you wanted the politics to be of the shape that would have make progress on these kinds of questions, what would drive that politics? Well, you would want an engaged electorate. You would want people who are literate. You would want people who had some empathy for, and so that led me from this idea of moving from goals that are numbers to goals that are traits. In other words, what in society can you tweak that's a trait, a characteristic, a tool that can amplify our potential to have a good Anthropocene, and there are some. So traits is my new goal. And I tweeted about this last year. This started for me as a bunch of tweets. I did this, by the way, Twitter matters. I'll explain why. Strategy for sustainable human progress: bend, stretch, reach, teach, reveal, reflect, rejoice, repeat. I'll elaborate. And I did this set of, I did 8 more tweets, one for each word. So now basically I'm just going to expand slightly on each of those 140 character tweets, and then we can get to a discussion. So bend, what does bend mean? Well, you know, obviously means that overused word resilience to some extent. Can we have a design for New York City with sea level, no new normal sea level for centuries to come? What do you do if you have a coastal city, the huge investments? Well, Mayor Bloomberg last year said in a big speech, "We will not retreat." That's not very tenable. So now but think about, can you think of a way a mayor could give a speech that was, "We will retreat"? You think of adjectives. We'll retreat carefully. We'll retreat smartly. We will withdraw. We will, can you think of anything that would get that mayor reelected? That would be like a withdrawal or we will reinvent ourselves. Maybe reinvention. How about we will reinvent New York? Well, maybe that should be it. Let me write that down. And there are designs for how you can do this. You can have a soft substrate. You can have walkways like the High Line. There's ways to move forward. But so how do you create the politics for that? And how do you create the conversation for that? That's bend. But there's another kind of bend. Billy Parrish, the guy with the bare feet over on the left there, I met him in 2005 in Montreal at the climate treaty talks. He was a great, dynamic activist, Energy Action Coalition guy, you know, 350 grew out of that. And all of that was meritorious. It was really good and valuable, and there were these young people in the hallways, you know, talking to these gray suits and saying, "This is our climate." Great stuff. But he realized at a certain point that that wasn't enough. And so as of now, Billy Parrish in 2014 runs this company called Mosaic, which is a small investor way to build capital for solar panel installations that wouldn't happen otherwise because people don't have the upfront money to do the installation. I threw in $400 just to see how it works. You get paid a 4.5% annual, return on your money. And it's kind of a fund, and it's still got lots of problems and questions. So here's a guy, he's like a fish swimming upriver. Got blocked by a rock over here, swim over, keep going, keep going. So he's bending, he's adapting. You know, that kind of adaptability and agility is what I'm talking about when I say bend. It's not just resilience. Stretch is Ben Gulak. He's kind of another sort of amazing character. I wrote about him a couple of years ago. He's at MIT, an incoming freshman. I think before he got to MIT, his family went to China on a trip, and he saw the pollution and the traffic, and he said, "I'm going to invent an electric motorcycle." And I mean, he's an unusual kid. His grandfather had an advanced metalworking shop that he could use, and so he came back and he actually acted on his dream. Now, 9 billion people riding around in electric motorcycles isn't going to solve the world's problems, especially if we don't have non-polluting energy providing the electricity for the grid powering those motorcycles. But what I love is his ability to stretch, to stretch. And what we need to do is to facilitate that by sustaining basic science. And that's an area where, at least there, even George Will, he wrote a couple of columns about this a year or two ago, and I was like, go, 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 George. But then I wrote some pieces about his column saying, if this is a mission for you, make it a mission. It can't just be a one-column thing. But he was saying Republicans have to pay attention to basic science. But no one has paid attention to basic science. No one. This is a graph of 50 years. This is from Sputnik at the left till the Great Recession at the right. And this is basic non-defense R&D by field. And you can see health has dominated. We all care about health. You know, the war on cancer is basically that blue bar. It got up to about 40 billion a year. And now it's shrinking a little, and it didn't really work. We still have, cancer rates are kind of like, they're not going down. The space race was yellow. You know, it worked. See, it takes about 20 billion, 30 billion a year to accomplish something that's big and ambitious, and that's what we did in the 70s, the 60s and 70s. We got to the moon, space shuttle, blah, 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 and that's kind of petered away. Energy is the green band, and you can see to me it looks like a python that swallowed a rabbit a week ago. And the rabbit was the energy crisis in the 70s. And everyone chastised Ronald Reagan for turning off the energy R&D, but no one has chastised the Republican and Democratic administrations and Congresses ever since that never turned it back on. Clinton Gore didn't turn it back on, no one turned it back on. And you can see there's a blip that was the stimulus package. But that's what I've been told by people who study innovation, and what you need to build is, if you want a culture of young people going into research, is you need sustained commitment to science. That's actually worse in some ways, having a bubble of money like that. You need people to know there's going to be careers down the end, and we haven't done it at all. It's just a shame. And when you look at that green band, I have another graph I could show you another day, or go on the web. Most of that R&D is fossil or nuclear. A tiny, tiny portion of that is renewable. So we're not engaged remotely on the energy quest that would be required if we really wanted to take seriously the challenge of decarbonizing our affordably in our politics, our energy system. We're not even remotely there. Reach is reach. It's reaching out. It's empathy and moving knowledge around to where it's needed. There are some wonderful examples of how the internet and online communication and social networks are facilitating an explosive growth in the potential to do this. In India, extension services for agriculture are now using YouTube videos where there's one extension agent working in one village, in a country with hundreds of millions of people still in rural situations. You need amplification of message. And so what they've done is they're working with farmers. They'll do where the farmer explains in a video an innovation, a different way of planting, a different seed variety, a different way of watering, and then that goes around via the smartphone explosion and the computer in the local internet cafe. And so it's almost like the Grange Hall used to be where this would happen, the seed store, and now it's a global conversation that's happening. And now we come to Twitter. How many of you are on Twitter? Well, that's pretty good. It's, maybe 20%. Raise your hands one more time. I want to see how many. Oh, no, maybe, what do you think, 25%? Okay, more. So you think it's more. All right, so anyway, Twitter is your friend, okay? Pedagogically and in terms of your own learning and collaborative efforts. And the hashtag is an invention, just as maybe not as important as a more efficient photovoltaic panel, but I put it up there. It's an invention. It was invented by a man, Chris Messina, a young guy in 2007, one day said, hey, on Twitter, how do you feel about using pound for groups, as in bar camp with a pound sign? And bar camp is a term that programmers use. I have no idea what the origins of it. But you can add any term there, and you end up with a conversation that's asynchronous, meaning those tweets stay there, or it can be a live chat where everyone is sort of asking questions and answering questions. It's global. And because, again, the cell phone explosion, there's close to 7 billion cell phone subscriptions on the planet now. That's almost as many as there are people. And so, but a lot of people have the impression that Twitter is just like, Justin Bieber, Kardashian, Bieber, Kardashian, blah, 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 blah. And it is. I don't even know who those people are. But, well, I know who Justin Bieber is. I haven't figured out the Kardashians. But here, look at this. Okay, so you can cut through all that crap. There's a signal in the noise, and these are hashtags that are really important. EdTech is educational technology in the classroom. Enviro Ed is you. AgChat is the frontiers of agriculture. WJChat is web journalism. It's a weekly conversation about where people are trading best practices and failures in relation to trying new infographics or whatever at newspapers. Paceblog is my blogging course, Blogging a Better Planet. All my courses, and several now that we have through the Academy, are all, you have your hashtag with your course. AEASS 2014 is the hashtag for this group. And you can have a running and then reviewable conversation that persists after the meeting. People can attend the meeting in a way through the hashtags. Bird class is my favorite, though. Bird class is Margaret Rubega. I don't know if she's here. Does anyone know Margaret at UConn, University of Connecticut? She teaches a course in bird biology, and every fall, I think it's in the fall, the students are required to get a Twitter account, and they have to, when they see a bird doing interesting behavior outside of class, because they wouldn't see that in class, they tweet about it. They tweet about it, and which is kind of funny. Tweet. And what's happened is, she's done this now for about 5 years. She was an early adopter. And her students, she says, are much more engaged with bird behavior than they were when they were required to do this, you know, in a pad and turn in some written assignment each week. Because it's there. It's a real-time thing. They're also real-time anyway that, you know, they'll see two robins chasing each other and they can kind of just do it at that moment. And actually, she started this before people were tweeting pictures and photos and video clips. And now it's become kind of a clearinghouse. I just was with some students today up in Beacon, New York, and we were looking at the bird class stream. And there were people asking this hashtag questions. Someone was in Mexico City and swears she saw a golden eagle, and she's saying, is that possible? She tweeted to that hashtag. So it's a wonderful mechanism for sharing and shaping ideas, for forming a beacon of authority amid all the crap. So it's a great thing. So just think about that bird class example. By the way, in terms of pedagogy, the students' output on Twitter is all time-stamped. So when I make your Twitter reach 15% of your grade, I can actually assess that. Teach, of course, is a no-brainer in some ways. Bend, stretch, reach, teach. But obviously, it's what we teach, how we teach. The courses I'm trying to work on in PACE now are much more about active learning, learning by doing. I'm not the first in any way to do this. This is an example at middle school of the familiar bridge building breaking competition. My wife was one of the teachers there. She runs a museum, a nature museum in Cornwall now, the education efforts. But anyway, what was interesting about this is her co-teacher came up with a cost-benefit aspect of this. So this is basically, you know, you have balsa wood, teams build bridges, then they add weight to see how they break, and whichever one holds the most weight sort of wins. It's a great way to engage students, but what they did, they added cost-benefit requirements so that they had to pay for their wood with virtual money, and then they had to assess performance overall, meaning cost and durability. And so what a great way to look at the world, which is so much like the real world. You know, again, going out of the real world, you're going to have to be making those kinds of trade-offs. So learning about trade-offs is great. My favorite, though, and I haven't written about it yet, I spoke at a meeting last year where I said, wouldn't it be great if we had a field trip? The one thing I could see percolating through our education system that would be meaningful would be a field trip to the boiler room of your school. If everyone in America going through school, elementary, high school, got to visit their boiler room, talk to the custodian, learn about the system, learn about their school as a system. Where does the oil, you know, it's oil heat. Where does that oil come from? How much does it cost? We'd have a much better base from which to have cogent discussions about energy policy and climate. And so then people at Solar One, which is a New York City-based nonprofit that works on syllabus elements for on environmental themes for schools, said, we're doing that, come on one. So in the Bronx, I went to the High School of Energy and Technology and went on the field trip to their boiler room. And it was so cool. The custodian is briefing the students on how the system works. And getting a custodian talking to students, just that alone is wonderful. So there's so much potential just sitting right there. You don't have to have big permission slips to go take and no cost. You know, you don't have to take a bus trip to the Museum of Natural History. You can do it right in your own school. I think it would be a great thing to promulgate. Bend, stretch, reach, teach, reveal. This is an important one, and it's become more possible than ever. Transparency is being imposed on organizations that don't want it, whether it's Snowden and the NSA, whatever you think about that, or whether it's Greenpeace and companies like Nestle. See, a few years ago, Greenpeace did a really great job of articulating the supply chain from these products that we eat without thinking, like Kit Kat bars, back to the forests in Borneo where the palm oil comes from. And this really resulted in change. I've written critically about some things that Greenpeace has done, like raiding GMO fields in Australia that were research, basic science research. But in this case, I think they really have done powerful work to reveal where stuff comes from, and then to have that pressure companies to change their supply chains. It's a great reveal. Here's reveal in a big way. Greg Asner's work at Carnegie Institution looking at Peruvian deforestation in relation to gold mining. This is artisanal gold mining. This is not big companies. This is freelancers running into the Amazon and digging these pits that are horribly destructive and toxic. And it's just fantastic to see what's possible, of course, with remote sensing as well. Deforestation rates in the Amazon, Brazil has become a leader in using remote sensing and monitoring to track deforestation. It's wonderful to see. And of course, now globally you can do it as well. Japan has satellites that can track methane and CO2 emissions. So you could start to see we're heading toward a point where there's no lying anymore, where you can see on a plant-by-plant basis who's actually emitting what. And if you want to have accounting for carbon, you need to have measurability. Here's another example of, sometimes we get into these big fractious fights, about fracking and things, and often society remains disengaged because it's sort of invisible. Methane is, you know, it's invisible, and unless you add an adulterant, it's not smelly. So here you have a beautiful sunny day in Colorado, an oil tank. And here you have the same tank through an infrared lens. So just changing the wavelength with which you view something can be transformative. This says there is a pollution problem here. This says, wow, what did I say it is? And so that to me says volumes about what's possible. And of course, these infrared cameras are cheap. So if you're an NGO in upstate New York and you don't want fracking, you should be going to the border area in Pennsylvania and just making sure that people understand that our practices so far are not responsible in terms of cutting these emissions. I'm not against fracking if it's done correctly. And there are ways to do it that greatly reduce the flows of methane from these and keep it in a pipeline so that it gets burned as a much cleaner fuel than coal. I'm actually for that, but I'm only for that if we can demonstrate that we can have the policies and the regulatory approach and the transparency that can make sure it's done responsibly. There's another aspect of revealing. This is like choosing your medium, sort of like with the wavelength of light. I can tell you the volume of the atmosphere at sea level pressure. So it's an elementary school classroom. I'm going to tell you it's X million cubic kilometers. I don't know the number. Or I could show people Adam Neumann's great illustration of this. That's all the liquid water. I mean, that's the volume of the atmosphere at sea level pressure. Put all the air in the atmosphere at sea level pressure. That is the atmosphere. Now, Al Gore used the varnish on the globe or something. There's different ways to make the case. Adam has done these wonderful examples with water as well. The world's liquid water, the world's potable water. And so just showing information in a different way reveals things that weren't necessarily clear before. Reflect. Reflect is science. Reflect is collecting information, thinking about it, deciding on trajectories for research, and then doing analysis and coming out with solutions or questions or new questions. And it's about making sure we maintain the capacity to collect information, to monitor the world. You know, without monitoring the world, we don't know, we can't recognize change. I love this, Jim Savitsky at the University of Colorado did this map of, this is 200 years of dam construction. This is from 1800 to 2003 or so. That's dams on American streams and rivers. Wow. Anthropocene, anyone? Yes, we have changed the planet. You know, we've changed the planet so profoundly. But you only see it if you're measuring and keeping track and assessing. So there's lots of room there too. Now comes the mushiest stuff, rejoice. I had the word rejoice in there because, as you all know, as people who are obviously attuned to the values of the environment beyond monetary ones, you know, ecosystem services are great, but I'm not a fan of that approach. There's so many services that are provided by having a sustained relationship with functioning, thriving landscapes that are immeasurable, unaccountable. And one of them is just getting outside and remembering this stuff. That's my son a few years ago in Redwood Park. That is really as important to maintain that relationship, to have the ability to rejoice. And also in terms of science, you know, religion has kind of had a lock on joy to a certain extent. You know, scientists are not allowed to be joyful. I know a lot of scientists who don't like to emote in public, and at least the physical sciences particularly. But it's okay. You know, the world is freaking awesome. So, you know, it's okay to say that. It's okay to sing about it. But we can't be limited to thinking about it's all out there that's joyful, meaning us getting out into a beautiful landscape like that. To me, I was in Beijing last week at a really important event. There's an entity evolving called Future Earth. It's going to replace IGBP and ICSU and all this soup of acronyms. It's a 10-year research initiative, internationally funded, to explore science in service of sustainability. And it was really interesting, but I took a walk. My last day in Beijing, I just went for a walk. I saw on a map that I was in the area near where the Olympics were, and there was this place called a fitness park. And I was fascinated, so I went there, and it was joyful. We'll just watch this. You know, in this mega city. Look at these towers. So having an urban landscape that has that density, it's still possible to have nodes of tranquility and places to dance, there are fountains. And I was also in 2009, I was in South Korea, in Seoul. I wrote an article for the New York Times about how they restored this little stream that had been buried under all these freeways and for decades. And the mayor at the time, who became South Korea's president briefly, Lee Moon-bak, said, we're going to rip out all this crap, it's not working anyway, and we're going to restore the Cheonggyecheon. And they did. And it's artificial. It's 90% of the water in this little beautiful stream is pumped in from the Han River nearby, up through a pipe. But it's created this green corridor, a cool place for strolling and for having your dinner or your lunchtime meal. The workers go there by the droves. They put in bus lanes instead of the highway. And so it's like a perfect Anthropocene artifact. It's natural in the sense that it's human nature that has created this, chosen to create a greener, more livable landscape in another mega city. So that to me is just as joyful as getting out into Yellowstone. I mean, maybe some part of me would say Yellowstone's better, but we have to be comfortable with that level. We have to enjoy ourselves, is what I'm saying. We have to get comfortable with ourselves and get away. That's the woe is me, shame on you thing becomes a circular firing squad if it's perpetuated too long. And so but there's one other element in my list. Remember, there's a bend, stretch, reach, teach, reveal, reflect, rejoice, repeat. So this is the hard one for me. It's about discipline. Stuart Brand wrote this marvelous book a few years ago called Whole Earth Discipline. The best thing about it was the title. Because without discipline, without the ability to stop and assess how are we doing, what's failing, what's not failing, it's okay to fail, but the only failures that really are okay are the ones where you're assessing them to learn how to do things better the next time. And it's like calisthenics, and I'm really bad at all this stuff. I don't work out enough, and I've gotten more cognizant of this. I've had health issues recently, so I actually did yoga with my wife recently, and I wanted to keep doing it, but I got to keep doing it. It's that discipline thing. So repeat has to be part of the menu. Now you can come up with your own list of terms. These are just my own kind of onomatopoeia, whatever, bend, stretch, reach, teach. There's many different ways to articulate what I'm talking about. But it's a set of characteristics for society and individual behavior that I think can get our trajectories in line with the goals that we seek. And if we get away from the numbers, which I think in the end are kind of paralytic, I think we have much more power. It's liberating. I'm going to give you one example of how you could think about this. I have two sons, and when they were young, everyone thinks about what their kids are going to be. And so you could think, okay, I want my son to be a doctor making $300,000 a year, $500, whatever. That's a goal. That's kind of a numerical, quantitative goal for your child. Or you can look in that crib and say, what are the characteristics I would want to imbue in this kid that would give this kid the best chance of navigating a turbulent, complicated century and having a productive life that's productive not just beyond their own, within their own life, but contributing to what we call a sustainable journey. And when I think about that, what would those qualities be? They're the same ones I just articulated: bend, stretch, reach, teach. It's a way of living. And if best practices, last thing, industry, you hear about best practices for whatever, and too often it's a set of numbers, and when it should be a culture. Best practices is a culture. If you go to the really smart businesses, you'll see that it's a culture. It's a way of thinking and behaving, not a set of numbers. So with that, I'll conclude that we are perfect. And yes, it's a really big asterisk. So thank you. Thank you.